My name is Ike Kong, and I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here. And this is Art Matters. And today we welcome back one of our favorite speakers, that is Kenneth Lapatin from the Getty Villa. And I'm going to read to you the brilliant and terse paragraph he gave to me to describe his entire career. Kenneth is a classical archaeologist, a curator of antiquities at the J. Paul Getty Museum. He's a graduate of Berkeley and Oxford. He's excavated in Greece, Italy, Israel, and England. You excavated in England? Okay, both above ground and underwater. Yeah, that would be above ground and underwater. His research interests include the materials, techniques, and functions of ancient art, luxury, and forgery. He is the author or editor of 17 books, now he's just showing off, including Luxus, The Sumptuous Arts of Greece and Rome, and has curated over a dozen exhibitions on topics ranging from polychrome statuary, Athenian vases, Hellenistic bronzes, and Roman silver, to medieval responses to antiquity, Pompeii, and its modern reception, and ancient gems and their afterlife. And that was, I believe, what you call a run-on sentence. However, we'll forgive you for it because it does show you the incredible breadth of his expertise and his fecundity as a curator. If you've seen his shows at the Getty, you know that he is an incredible talent. He always has been, and he's also extremely knowledgeable. And his name is Ken, and he hasn't seen the Barbie movie yet. So I'm trying to convince him that he has to go, as we all do. And now, when you see the Kens, you will think of. So with that, he's going to speak to us today on his favorite subject. I just wanted to mention that the book that I just said he wrote is available in our store. There are only 2 copies, but they're signed, so you can compete with them directly after the lecture. So please do that. I'm sure that you will enjoy. It's a beautiful, beautiful publication. Okay, Ken, do your thing.
Now a little bit of technical razzle-dazzle as we do away with the one PowerPoint and we start with the other. Yeah, good. I'm very grateful to Ike for inviting me and for having read and embellished that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to return to Santa Barbara here, and this is my first time back here since the pandemic, and it was wonderful to see with Ike earlier the new installations and exhibitions. I'm speaking, as Ike said, on one of my favorite topics and one that's occupied me a lot in recent years, which is ancient gems. And although I really can't see you, I think I can see you if I block the lights. How many of you might have been here 4 years ago when I was last here, when I lectured on ancient gems? Hands, maybe half a dozen. Do you remember anything about that lecture? You do. Well, then I apologize, but for the rest of you, there will be some overlap simply because that earlier lecture was a general overview of ancient gems. But today's talk takes a much deeper dive and is part of a larger project. That project is, as the title says, Searching for Dioscorides, a master ancient gem carver. And I show you, and we'll be focusing on, kind of as the hub of the wheel for what I'm going to talk about, the gem on the screen, which the Getty acquired in 2019, and it is the inspiration for my studies. It's an amethyst intaglio, and what I have here in this little bag is not the amethyst intaglio from antiquity, which my registrars at the Getty Villa would kill me if I was carrying around in a baggie in my pocket, but a very fine glass replica made from a cast by a modern gem engraver And this is how big that thing is, right? So I'll remind you at various points of the scale of the objects we're dealing with. The original gem is currently about to feature in an exhibition at LACMA, LA County Museum of Art, where I've been told that it's unfortunately quite poorly installed and not very well visible, but they have a huge photograph of it, about this size on the wall. So if you want to see it, you can see it very soon for LACMA, or come in a few months to the Getty Villa when it returns. We install it well. And
Don't forget that you're on camera.
I'm on
It will be posted.
oh, apologies to my colleagues at LACMA for their installation. My comments on their installation. Oh dear. Well, good you told me that early on. All righty. Moving along. So today, we're most familiar with ancient art in canonical forms in architecture, sculpture, and painting. And I show you on top examples from ancient Greece, although the marble is a Roman marble, and the bottom examples from ancient Rome, where the bronze is a Roman bronze. But this academic focus on these media, architecture, sculpture, and painting, rely on the construction of art history that can really be attributed, I think, to the 15th century Florentine architect and painter, Giorgio Vasari. We praise these monumental buildings and statues and painted pottery and wall frescoes, which stand in for the lost ancient paintings on panel, which Greek and Latin authors praised. But ancient writers also concern themselves with other media. And it is in the culminating 37th book of his encyclopedic Natural History, which provides a lot of information to us about ancient architecture, sculpture, painting, and other arts, that Pliny the Elder explicitly addresses gemstones, which he says in the opening sentence of his, again, the culminating 37th book of this large work, that many in antiquity considered gems to provide the highest and most perfect aesthetic experience of the wonders in nature. Now, engraved gems in antiquity were cut from a wide variety of stones, mostly what we, let's see if we can get this advanced, there we go. Mostly what we today call semi-precious stones, such as quartzes and chalcedonies, things like carnelians, jaspers, amethysts, rock crystal, and things like that. And these stones were imported to Greece and Rome from across the Mediterranean beyond. And this is a map that Lisbeth Thoresen has made up, which shows you some of the sources in North Africa, in Western Asia, in India, and fewer in Europe, where the ancients sourced their gems. And the sourcing of gems, the mining of gems, the trade in gems could be another lecture altogether that I won't give today because we're going to try to not keep you here till 8 o'clock tonight. Gems, engraved gems, basically come to us in two forms, intaglios and cameos. Both of these are modern-ish words. Intaglio comes from the Italian tagliare, to cut. Tagliatelle is sliced strips of pasta. And the carving, as you can see from the amethyst that's going around, is actually cut into the stone. And in the profile view, you can see it's a rather deep carving, that one. They can be shallow or deep, but they're cut into the stone. And the stones were frequently used as seal stones, so they could be pressed into clay or wax or some other soft material and leave an impression in relief. And this technique began in the Bronze Age. We have examples from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from the Indian subcontinent, millennia before the Greeks and Romans took up the craft. The cameo is essentially the reverse. Instead of the image being cut into the stone, the background is cut away, leaving the image in reverse. The origins of the word cameo are disputed, but cameos could be done in any stone, but they came to be carved of banded agates, often called sardonyx, layered stones that could be treated, chemically enhanced to increase the color contrast, where the light layer is cut away against the dark background, or vice versa. And the carvers would use essentially the same tools and techniques, and we have some knowledge of those tools from things like this. This is a it's an image of a lost gravestone of a teenage gem carver from Antiquity. And you can see at the very top, and you can see at the top, fragmentary, there's a drawing of a spindle or horizontal lathe that's driven by a bow and a string that's wrapped around it, so that when you move the bow back and forth, the string turns the post and it rotates a cutting tool. And now, if technology works, I will show you a very short video of a contemporary Iranian gem carver actually cutting on such a tool. And it's not actually the metal tool that cuts the gemstone. You'll see in a moment, the carver dips, he charges his little tool with an abrasive powder. The ancients used emery or corundum, which is 9 on the Mohs scale. Modern carvers use diamond dust. And that mixture of abrasive powder gets charged in the tool, and it's actually that powder that's cutting the stone. The tool is worn down because these stones are actually harder than the tool. The stones are about 7 on the Mohs scale. All of these quartzes and chalcidity. Iron is like 5 and bronze is weaker. But you can actually carve gems with straw if you charge it with the abrasive powder. And again, we could talk a lot more about technique, and we'll be looking at technique a bit. But here's an ancient Cornelian intaglio depicting the Greek hero Diomedes, who was one of those who went to Troy. There was a prophecy that Troy could not be taken if the Greeks did not capture the talismanic sacred statue of Athena. And here's Diomedes holding a sword. Here's the statue of Athena in drapery, and he's standing there. And I think you can see now the actual tool marks, the cuts of a few tools, some thin, some wider. Some places, I think down here in the ankle, we maybe see a preliminary cut that wasn't polished out. This is a pretty middling gem, and my dear friend and colleague Ruth Allen at the Carlos Museum in Atlanta, I don't think would be too upset with my saying that. Here I show you a bunch of modern gem engravers tools, mostly copper tipped, but also with steel, and these would allow, finer lines or thicker lines or little, we don't see them in this gem, sort of round circles. Here's a slightly higher quality rendering of the same myth in its more standard imagery, where Diomedes is actually sitting on an altar. He's holding the sword in his hand. He holds the statue of Athena in his other hand, and in front of him is another god, Poseidon, who's standing on a pillar, who's looking away because of the sacrilege. And you can see here there's somewhat more definition of the musculature. There's maybe more finish. You don't see those cuts straight in the stone. They've been overworked and polished out. And here's the same scene again. This one by our carver, Dioscorides, the gem that you can't see that's being passed around because it's so dark, also has the carver's signature, Dioscoridou of Dioscorides, in small letters, less than 1 millimeter high. Again, this is quite small. You see the same image. You have the altar, the sword, the hero holding the statue, the other statue on a pillar. Here you have an added element that's very important. Diomedes actually kills a priest or a temple guard, which is a sacrilege. And this is one of the important sacrileges that's necessary for the taking of Troy and therefore the founding of Rome, because Rome in myth was founded by Trojan exiles. But this is, again, a much, I think you can recognize, higher quality, much more finely polished. The muscles, the drapery, the details, the proportions are all done. And again, remember how small this is. This is in the Devonshire collection owned by the Dukes of Devonshire at Chatsworth. They got it after the French Revolution. It had belonged to Louis XIV of France. And in the 19th century, it was mounted as part of this splendid Devonshire parure because the niece of the Duke went to the Tsar's coronation and needed a bunch of jewelry. So there was a diadem and a necklace and a breastplate and a bandeau and a tiara. And you can see our gem was part of this one piece. But it's actually, I did some measurements, it's smaller than a nickel, right? So all of this detail is packed in to this image, carved on a very, very small scale. And I want to remind you not only of the scale, but part of the magic of gems is how they look different in different light. They can be opaque, transparent, or like this stone, translucent. So if they're lit from behind or they're lit from the front, they're going to be darker or lighter. Part of the magic of gems, I think, was that in an age before electricity, they almost seem to contain and emit light. And in the gift shop here, there are a few gems and pendants, not engraved ones that I saw, but there's one that's rutilated quartz that's looking like a rock crystal, but it's got gold bands inside. And gems of that stone were actually used often in antiquity for images of Helios, Sol, or Apollo, the sun god, this idea of rays. So there's also mythologies and ideologies that can be associated with different stones. I have already, without a lot of introduction, shown you 3 stones that all bear the signature of Dioscorides. The ones in the intaglios are carved backwards, so they read forwards when you made an impression. The one on the cameo is written to be read straightforwardly. And these all come from old collections. I put down that they're attested to certainly by the 17th century, if not before. The Heracles wrestling the 3-headed hellhound Cerberus may well be a gem that Cellini mentioned in 1525, talking about Michelangelo, and Michelangelo said it was the most extraordinary thing he ever saw. There's good argument for that, but again, that's not proven. But again, I want to just compare the same scene in a more mundane rendering. You've already seen Diomedes. Here I show you Heracles wrestling Cerberus. This cameo is in the Hermitage. It belonged to Catherine the Great. The standard publication of Hermitage gems claims that this is ancient. You can see it's not as fine as our gem. I wonder if it might not be a post-antique collector's copy of our gem. And as we'll see, the authentication and attributions of gems is very fraught. Here I show you another portrait of Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator. who was also imaged by our carver Dioscorides. Profile faces are much more common in gems or glyptic art. They're much easier to carve, they're much easier to read. That's why most of our coins have profile faces on them, not frontal faces. And the Demosthenes in the lower left is obviously much shallower than this carving by Dioscorides. So what do we know about Dioscorides himself? I know there are classical scholars in the room. This pleases me greatly because they will know the thing you do if you want to know is you go to the 85-volume German encyclopedia of Klassischen Altertumswissenschaft by Polyvasova, and you look up in volume 5, which is D to E, Dioscorides. And you do that, and you have pages and pages and pages of entries about Dioscorides, many different Dioscorides, and the most famous one isn't our Dioscorides. It's a doctor who wrote De Materia Medica. We have a portrait of him inscribed on the title page of this wonderful manuscript in Vienna. There are 15 other Dioscorides that Pauli and Vasova tell us about. And they include 2 writers of epigrams, a rhetorician, a skeptic philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, and also a mosaicist from Samos who signed this mosaic from Pompeii that's now in the Naples Museum. None of these is our guy. We also have other people named Dioscorides, like the man whose statue on the right of the left-hand slide was erected at Delos with his wife Cleopatra, or this guy on a gravestone who's wearing a short tunic and cape, who's a cavalryman on a tombstone from the British Museum, another Dioscorides, not our guy. For some reason, and I have to do more research into the history of scholarship and what Pauli Vasova were doing, why our guy in Pauli Vasova is last. Why he's the 16th, I don't know. But he is, as the German says, the most famous stone carver from the time of Augustus. So he's famous, and he's famous because people like Pliny knew about him and wrote about him. Most of the writings on ancient art that we have from antiquity, from people like Pliny or the Greek traveler Pausanias, talk about works of art we don't have. And that's true also in the case of Dioscorides, because Pliny tells us in his book 37, if we go in a few pages from that opening about the most pleasing aesthetic experience I began with, he talks about different famous carvers. And he begins with Pergodoles, who is undoubtedly the most brilliant artist in this field. And after him in fame have been Apollonides, Cronides, and the man who made the excellent likeness of the divine Augustus, which his successors have used as a seal, Dioscorides. Now, of these other famous carvers, Pergodoles, who carved, we are told by Pliny in another passage, the seal stone of Alexander the Great, and Alexander apparently wouldn't allow any other gem carvers to depict him. Of Pergodoles, we have nothing except for wishful thinking. Gems like these, which aren't signed, but that are so fine, some scholars think they must be by Pergodoles himself. But how do we know? Or we have this stunning object, which was known only from a 1724 engraving, an image of Alexander, signed Pergodoles, which reappeared on the European market just about 2 months ago and was auctioned off, which is obviously post-antique. Of course, collectors would want to have the work of the most famous gem carver of all antiquity, Pergodoles, who worked for Alexander the Great. Of the other carvers mentioned by Pliny, the next is Apollonius. And of him, we do seem to have one fragmentary gem, and you can see the same 1724 book knew about it, and they replaced in the engraving the bit of the gem that is broken. It's also in the Devonshire collection, and I had the very good fortune to visit last spring on a very snowy day, and I sat down in the basement of Chatsworth House looking at gems with the engraver, and this is really an exquisite but fragmentary carving, and probably is by Apollonides. The Duke of Devonshire paid 1,000 guineas for it in 1728, which was an exorbitant sum. We don't have anything by Cronius, the other carver Pliny mentions, but regarding Dioscorides, we are on somewhat firmer ground. Pliny tells us that he made the excellent portrait of Augustus that his successors used as an imperial seal, and we are told something very similar by the Roman historian Suetonius that also tells us that Augustus at first used a figure of a sphinx, then the head of Alexander as a seal, and last his own image engraved by Dioscorides, which practice was retained by succeeding emperors. And we'll talk a little later about how Pliny and Suetonius knew this. Suetonius was friends with Pliny's nephew and adopted son, and he may have read Pliny, but he had other means, being an imperial official, to know something about Augustus's seal. We also hear about the seal from Dio Cassius, who wrote in Greek a Roman history, and I won't read this to you. You can read it yourself. It talks about Augustus's different seals, the Sphinx, and then his own likeness, and then it used by other emperors except for Galba. Dioscorides, the carver, isn't mentioned, but we're clearly talking about his product. And because of that, as with Pergodoles, many scholars have very optimistically attributed surviving gems, like these three cameos, two portraits on the sides, and in the center, the famous Gemma Augustea, now in Vienna, have been attributed to Dioscorides. But again, this seems to me to be wishful thinking. They've also attributed to Dioscorides a series of intaglios. And the one on the left, we'll talk about a little more, is actually inscribed in the upper right with the initials of Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a great collector of gems and even had his own carvings in them. So when we comes to Dioscorides, we really have three different kinds of evidence. We have the literary evidence, which I've just shown you. We have what we'll call art historical evidence, which is archaeological, and that comes sort of in between. We have these three and other gems that have the signatures of Dioscorides' sons. And they tell us that Hylos, the son of Dioscorides, made this, the one on the far left. Hierophilos, the son of Dioscorides, the one in the middle, and these aren't for scale. And it's this third one, which was a big rock crystal intaglio of Athena that unfortunately was dropped and broken, but has been glued back together, that has the longest inscription of a gem engraver that I know, that tells us that the third son, Eutyches, the son of Dioscorides, made it, but adds another piece of information, Agiaios, from Agiai, which is a town in Cilicia in southwestern Turkey. So we know the family from this one inscribed gem began in, did I say southwestern, southeastern Turkey, began there and then eventually made its way to Rome because Augustus didn't show up on Dioscorides' doorstep. The family moved to Rome following the possibilities of trade. And in fact, it seems likely that Dioscorides, around 63 BC, at the time the Romans under Ptolemy the Great conquered this area, driving out the last king of the Seleucids, who came after Alexander and ruled for centuries. When Ptolemy conquered this area, it's likely at that point that Dioscorides went west. Oh, my prop, thank you. So that's maybe our second kind of evidence. Our third and best kind of evidence are the gems themselves. Now, there's very little reason to doubt the authenticity of these three gems. They're of uniformly high quality, although quality is never absolute proof of authenticity. But they're consistent within themselves in ways I'll elaborate on later. They also have very long histories, although forgeries are made in every period. But I've been trying, based on our gem, to see as many of the gems that have been attributed to Dioscorides as possible, whether things that aren't signed, that people have optimistically attributed to him, or signed work. And unfortunately, there are over 200 gems with Dioscorides' name on them or have been attributed to him while uninscribed. Fortunately, about 180 of these are obvious forgeries. And here I show you just 5 of the so-called Poniatowski collection, which were carved by a number of modern carvers in the early 19th century, actually thousands of gems with the names of the most famous carvers. So we have more Pergodoles, we have more Cronios, we have more Apollonides, and we have lots of Dioscorides. And these things are now very recognizable by their big oval shape, their shallow carving, and their very florid styles with bizarre iconographies. So fortunately, of these more than 200 gems, I can take about 180 off the table. But as a matter of method, what I've found to be very helpful in trying to organize this material is to look at it through the history of collections. As I said, gems that have been known earlier, I think, are more likely, but not guaranteed to be ancient than the ones that came to light later. And it was, in fact, this, and so here, in addition to the 3 I've already shown you, I show you 2 more that have been known even earlier, so they're in the order that they've become known, 2 of which were in the hands of Fulvio Orsini in the 16th century that went through various hands that are now in Naples and in the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge. It was in 1724 that a great scholar, collector, and profligate spy, Baron Philippe von Stosch, published a book in very deluxe in Latin and French, whose title in English would be Ancient Engraved Gems on which the names of their carvers have been inscribed. And Stosch wrote his book in part because already in 1724, he was fighting with the prevalence of forgeries, and he published forgeries. I showed you that Alexander the Great with Pergodoles came from this book. Of Dioscorides, he published 7 gems. This is his index, again, in Latin and in French. And here, just for color, is a medallion of Stosch as a young man, and it was Stosch's personal gem collection that was one of the first important publications of Johann Joachim Winckelmann, the great art historian, who was a gem expert before he started working on marbles and other things. So Stosch published 7 gems by Dioscorides, and here are the plates. And they're in a different order, but you'll recognize on the bottom row 4 of the 5 I've shown you already. Here are those gems. And then in the top row, there are 3 gems. And the ones I show you below aren't necessarily the same gems that Stosh knew. There was a great tradition among collectors of making copies, of having replicas or of having casts, of making engravings from impressions, or of making collectors' copies from impressions. None of the gems below are ancient, although they correspond to the engravings. This one in particular, and the gem itself is in Paris, the letter forms, and in fact the letter forms of the signatures of all of these is problematic, demonstrate that they weren't carved by Dioscorides, but we have letters of a 16th century collector who saw a gem very like this, and he describes it, and he describes the details of the letter forms that I'll show you again in a minute, that have small dots at the corners and thin lines before. And the O's are perfectly circular, they're not square. So this seems to be a copy of a gem we now don't know where it is. So it's not going to tell us a lot about Dioscorides' work. 2 of these seem to be portraits of Augustus. This one of Augustus's right-hand man, Maecenas. So it makes sense, but they're not really good evidence for Dioscorides' own work. About 60 years after Stosh published those 70 gems, Domenico Augusto Bracci did a new edition. His was in Italian and Latin for signed gems, and he had many, many more. He had 2 volumes, and he added 7 more gems to the corpus of Dioscorides. One of them is our amethyst intaglio, which wasn't known to Stosh at the time he published his book, although it was known at the time. And then if we go from the left, we have a Serapis that I've yet to find, although I found a 19th century cast. We have a woman wearing a necklace and horns, who's generally taken to be Io, the lover of Zeus, whom Hera turned into a heifer. It's also been identified as Artemis Tauropolis. The 3rd gem was in the British Museum. It was purchased in Italy in the 18th century. In the 19th century, it was given to the British Museum. In the early 20th century, it was thought to be modern. It was transferred to the medieval department. And by 1970, it couldn't be located. So it's not part of this recent British Museum scandal of gems disappearing. It's a very fine gem, and from the impression, I think there's good reason to think it might be by Dioscorides, but again, we don't have the gem itself. And then these last 2 are forgeries, in my view. You can see the inscriptions, like the first one, they're abbreviated, and the carving isn't as fine. And this one, again, is a glass paste, so a replica of a gem. I haven't been able to find the gem itself. So since then, more gems have come to light and have been attributed to our carver, again, with inscriptions that are abbreviated or broken and whose carving is not nearly as fine as ours. But there's a question with many of these gems: are the gems modern forgeries of Dioscorides, or are they ancient gems to which his name has been added? Or the second fragment, are they ancient gems with somebody else's name that ends in Dios that has been taken as a truncation of Dioscorides? We know for a fact that ancient gems were recut with the names of famous carvers. Stosh writes about this, and several months ago, this cameo of Germanicus, the famous cameo of Valmoden, resurfaced, having been lost for many years. It was discovered in 1763, and almost immediately after it was discovered, somebody carved the name Dioscorides on it, hoping it would sell for a better price. General Valmoden bought it, and he knew the inscription was false. And you can see the inscription here in an early impression of the cameo, but it was subsequently erased. And in Tassi's book of 1791, the inscription is mentioned, but it says, "Is modern as I have it from the possessor." So this is one of presumably many examples where false inscriptions have been added to gems. So this is really a fraught field. Since then, more gems have come to light. The Perseus, again, with the abbreviated signature. The Julius Caesar, which I think takes our Demosthenes and Caesar coins and makes this exquisite frontal portrait of Caesar with the Lituus, because he was Pontifex Maximus, and the star, of course, is Halley's Comet after his assassination. But the carver who made this extraordinary work seems to have misspelled Dioscorides' name, and he uses the wrong form of sigma, the 4-bar sigma, rather than what we call the lunate sigma, like a C. It's a splendid piece of carving. It just happens to be modern. The Nike in RISD, again, has the broken signature and copies other gems. And then the last one is the Bellerophon and Pegasus in Boston, which was found in a Roman vineyard in 1918. And of these, this is the only one that I think has any hope of being by our carver. And here I show you a fresco from Pompeii that shows the same composition complete of the hero taming the winged horse. The painting has Athena in it. The gem doesn't. In the middle is a gem by a less assured hand, but is better preserved, now in Vienna. And then the lower left, you see a sculpture of this same type. One of the things that's remarkable about this gem, although it's clearly damaged, is the way the different surfaces are dealt with, the drapery, the feathers, the foreshortening, especially of the horse and its hind legs, and this very complicated overlapping of figures, and again, the depth. My former colleague, Laura Marist, until this summer, at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, she's now moved to Harvard, she and I were looking at this very closely together, trying to see what we could find of the signature in the break, and she found traces of the lower cuts of the signature in the break, which demonstrates the stone at least had been inscribed before it was broken, which again isn't proof of authenticity, but seems to tell us more about this splendid stone. So in my view, we have these, how many are there? 5, 6, 7, 8, one of which doesn't survive. There are also other things that don't survive. This cameo fragment, which has part of the signature of Dioscorides and 2 figures whose limbs are interlocking, sitting on a rock with a lion skin, very fine carving. Again, no real reason to doubt it, but we don't have it. And then this is a glass, ancient glass cast of an intaglio that also is inscribed Dioscorides. I've only seen this in Gisela Richter's 1971 book. I've never seen the gem, so I want to remain agnostic about it. So that brings us to the problem of the unsigned gems that Dioscorides might have made for the Emperor Augustus and others. And these have all been attributed to him. The attributions are possible. To be honest, this, for my project, which is going through, as you can see already, a lot of previous scholarship, but also autopsy of the gems, I haven't yet inspected these myself. And there's, I think, possibility that Dioscorides would have carved them, but it's also wishful thinking. As an example, I want to show you this ruby intaglio in the collection of Guy Ladrière in Paris. This only came to light in 1971. It's carved of a ruby, which is a much rarer stone in the ancient Mediterranean. Rubies and sapphires are essentially the same mineralogically. They just have different trace elements that will make their colors blue or gray or red, but they're all corundum. They're 9 on the Mohs scale. They're much harder. This one has been tested. It's said to be Burmese. As far as I'm aware, there are no Burmese rubies in archaeological context from the ancient Mediterranean. It's also odd that its shape, as you can see the rear view, is very irregular. It's not an irregularly shaped stone. But the strangest thing, perhaps, is how lifelike the image of Augustus has been. And this is what Pliny says, that his seal carved by Dioscorides was very lifelike. But this is, for me, too lifelike. Augustus, into his 70s, was always depicted as a young man. There weren't these wrinkles and these creases in his face. Also, while there's a lot of attention to the face, the hair is abbreviated, the wreath is abbreviated. And for me, if you need proof that our man didn't carve this gem, compare the ear of Demosthenes. I find it very difficult to believe that the carver of this would have carved that even on a bad day. But this is subjective. You might feel differently. But this is the kind of looking at collection history, about material history, at iconography, at technique, at quality and depth. And the ruby has no very long history. On the other hand, this intaglio, which I showed you before, which has been known since the Renaissance, it was seen by Ghiberti. Lorenzo de' Medici carved his initials on it, and it was actually featured, or an adaptation of it, was featured in Botticelli's portrait of Simonetta de Vespucci. It's kind of a copy that she's wearing in cameo of this gem, and there are also Renaissance plaquettes. So this was very well known in the Renaissance. It was attributed to Dioscorides, like all nice gems. It's called the seal of Nero, colloquially, because we have the myth of Apollo and Marsyas, and Apollo with the lyre appears on Neronian coinage, and Nero is most famous for what? Fiddling while Rome burns, right? So this has been taken to be the seal of Nero, which it was not. It's also been attributed to Dioscorides, and there's an irony because the real seal of Nero, we're told by Suetonius and Pliny, was the seal of Augustus by Dioscorides. But was this gem by Dioscorides? When I first read this attribution, I just thought, well, it's another example of scholarly wishful thinking. Then I was able to study it very closely, both through photographs and in person. You see on the right the official museum photograph. You see on the left my crappy photograph. I show you this just because I want to put my fingers in the image, but also because, again, I want to remind you how these things look differently in different light sources. And what was really frustrating for me when I was in Naples, and I was thrilled because they gave me this gem, but what was frustrating for me is I needed a stereoscopic camera, because what I wanted the photos to record is how deep the carving is here, especially, and I think you get a sense of it, in the thighs, the bodies here, and then in other places it's super shallow. So there's a great variation of depth and complexity. But for me, what was the kicker? Again, this is very traditional art historical analysis in a way, is if we compare the seated figure of Diomedes to the seated figure or the bound figure of Marsyas. If we look at the section of the torso, the bend in the abdomen, the three-quarter view of the thigh, the outline of the arm, these things are very close to one another. So I'm actually willing to accept the Sigillo di Nerone as a work of Dioscorides, also because of the importance to the political propaganda of the Emperor Augustus of this myth of Apollo and Marsyas. There was actually a monument in the Roman Forum of that myth. So our corpus grows slightly. So if we take this as a conservative corpus, wrapping up now, what can we say about Dioscorides? The work is of very high quality. It's also very deep, by and large. You've seen this before. Here you can see how rounded and deep and even undercut the cameo is. Things like Demosthenes might have been used for a seal, but one scholar, in fact, talking about the gem on the left in Cambridge, actually complained that technically the carving is almost too deep to make it easy to make seals. This is a feature of his. Another feature seems to be he likes statuary. The Demosthenes copies a well-known type that we know was first produced in Athens to honor the orator hundreds of years before Dioscorides' life. And the Mercury in Cambridge actually copies a sculptural type now in the Vatican, and that head on the Vatican statue is another ancient head that's been misattached. So don't let the heads bother you. Look at the form of the body. Consider, too, that lost Hermes Mercury, formerly in the British Museum, also seems to be a statue type and has a little base. Dioscorides also likes a lot, which many other carvers don't, these complex overlapping compositions. Diomedes, Heracles, Bellerophon, Apollo, Marsyas, and I didn't even mention there's a small figure here, Olympus, the attendant of Marsyas who begs Apollo. And of course, that cameo we were being announced on also shares these features. These are distinctive and don't show up very much in ancient glyptic. We can add to that this gem in Naples, which shows a kind of Achilles, or Alexander the Great as Achilles. Again, very complicated. He's standing with his weaponry. He has his shield on a rock. So we have these landscape elements, which Dioscorides seems to like. Some scholars writing about him see him at the cusp between Hellenistic realism and Augustan classicism. I see him as an outstanding carver whose style is in no way limited by ability or period, but is driven by the image. The Demosthenes is a representation of a well-known type where the orator has these kneaded brows. It's a Hellenistic type, so he's carving in Hellenistic style. When he's carving the EO, and here it's important that the signature goes over the break, so I think it's original, and it has those dots I talked about. When he carves the EO, he carves this very beautiful, wrinkle-free, idealized classical type. His style changes with the need of the commission. I'm very reluctant to say this is early, this is middle, this is late Dioscorides. Technically, the work is so good, he can do whatever he wants. And comparing the compositions he's done to other gems with similar compositions by other carvers, they always seem much more natural and relaxed. They seem to breathe. I don't remember why I showed this again to you. I think am I going in the right direction? Let me look at my notes. That will remind me what I thought I wanted to say to you. Isn't it great when we skip ahead past so much I've already said? Right, yes. So I did say I wanted to address how did Pliny and Suetonius, writing decades after Augustus and Dioscorides know for a fact that Dioscorides carved Augustus's seal. Suetonius, as I said, might have copied that information from Pliny, and he was on very good terms with Pliny the Younger. But it's not impossible that one or both of these authors, in their official imperial capacities as bureaucrats, saw impressions of Augustus's own seal. And Suetonius, after all, was responsible for the imperial archives. Now, beyond the lost seal of Augustus, as I said, it's not impossible that some of these surviving gems can be linked to Augustan propaganda, and some more than others. This is why I wanted this slide. Some scholars have seen in the Alexander the Great a parallel for Augustus's own imitation of Alexander. Hermes was an important god to Augustus. Demosthenes was a figure that could be admired by Augustus or then Octavian when he was attacking Mark Antony. Cicero, when he was attacking Mark Antony, called his speeches Philippics after Demosthenes' speeches. So we can see Demosthenes as an anti-Antonian character. Heracles and Cerberus, I think, is almost too generic. I'm not going to push that to make an argument. We've talked about Diomedes, Io and Bellerophon, I'm not sure, and we've talked about this. So we have maybe 5/8 of this imagery can be linked to Augustus, and I'm sure if we put our minds to it, we could push that harder. It's probable that gems like this, maybe without the diadem in intaglio, something like that, would have been the seal of Augustus. Now, despite the fame in literature of Dioscorides, by the Middle Ages, he seems to have been forgotten. Fun fact, in the Hereford Mappamundi, the most important of medieval maps of the world that you see here, in the lower right-hand corner, there's an image of the Emperor Augustus, who's dressed like a pope with a papal tiara. He's sending out ambassadors to the known world, and he has a document giving them instructions saying that it's sealed with his own seal. And in this medieval representation, the seal of Augustus takes the form of a medieval seal, but such medieval seals were often ancient seals set within medieval mounts. On the Hereford Mappamundi, the seal actually says, I'm too close to this now, but it says, I think, Imperatore Augusti Cesare, right? And the seal itself is missing. I've looked at this a while, and my mind invents faces in there, but I don't think we see Augustus. And despite his fame, Dioscorides, in literature, Dioscorides seems to have been forgotten by the medievals. But in the modern period, as we've seen from Stosch and others on, he was praised and his work was collected. And when it came time for the great Austrian Imperial Museum, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, to be built at the turn of the 20th century, when statues of famous artists were erected and put on top, up there with Apelles and Lysippus and Polyclitus and Phidias, a statue was erected of Dioscorides himself, holding a rather large gem. I haven't been up to the roof. I don't know, more research is needed, if the sculptor of this statue, Julius Donath, carved any image on it or what that might be. The museum has one of the great collections of ancient gems, including the big Gemma Augustea I've shown you, but nothing that certainly can be attributed to the hand of Dioscorides himself. But a lot more research remains to be done. As I said, this is work in progress. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, anybody have questions for Ken?
And you can ask me about things I didn't talk about, too. I just didn't want deep dives about engraving or magnification or sources of gemstones. Mary?
Do you have any of the, they're used as seals for things, and so have they remained, are there any seals extant that, and how do you make it, and how is that preserved, and how does that impact with the gem itself?
Right. We do have ancient sealings, meaning clay. They're often called bullae, but they're clumps of clay with gem impressions in them. We have tens of thousands of them, usually from archives where they were scrolls were wrapped and then they were sealed for contracts, documents, receipts, and inevitably the papyrus scrolls almost inevitably get burnt or lost on the island of Delos or in Seleucia in the Tigris. Whole archive buildings burnt, and the documents have been lost, but the bullae have been fired, and we have those sealings, which are then impressions of gems. Those gems we don't have the gems, but we have the impressions. In other cases, we have the gems, but not the modern impressions. We know that they were used for wax. We have anecdotes in ancient literature about thieves making casts of impressions because doors were locked with lock and key, but also just by wrapping a string around the doorknob and putting a seal on it. So somebody could break in, but you'd know they break in. But thieves could make casts of the seals and then relock the doors and reseal them. So there's all kinds of shenanigans around sealings. But I think we also have gems on this level that are more showpieces. Even if the inscriptions are carved in retrograde, that's a convention. And as Martin Hennig said about the Cambridge gem, they're almost carved too deeply to make impressions well. They're for showing off their real luxury pieces. But we have a few of these clay bullae at the Getty, but there's a ton of them in Baghdad, I guess they're still in Delos unless they've been transferred to Athens. I've seen the publication, but I haven't seen them themselves, and a few other sites where archives have been excavated for sealings. Sealings, S-E-A-L, not ceilings. Yes?
So we know that there's no separation of duties between the artist who creates what the image is going to be and the carver. It's the same person?
Yes, but the carver is sometimes using models that pre-exist. So, I've shown you parallels. This statue type, we have the bust that we know was carved in response to a democratic Athenian popular movement to honor Demosthenes after his death. And we know the original of the statue, of which I've showed you one marble, but we have several marbles and bronzes. Those date hundreds of years before. So that image is being invented somewhere else, and he's carving it. This image, I've shown you multiple versions of. We don't know who exactly invented that iconography. It might have been by our carver, might not have. Some of these things, there are lots of versions of this without the horns. It seems to have been very popular. So, like many master artists, he's inventing imagery that others are copying, but he's also picking up imagery like this that is pre-existent. So is that answering your question, or am I missing?
No, it does. But I have a quick follow-up, which is, then that would make it harder to identify the hand of the artist. Because if there's a model or an image that's passed down, much like tracing the similarities of composition or depth of carving or aspects of what's being created, it would make it harder to identify the hand.
It does. It makes it harder, but I think not impossible, because you have composition, but I showed you this composition exactly by another carver, and you wouldn't mistake those carvers. So you have composition, and you have technique, and you have style, which are things that intersect. But with the unsigned gems, it becomes difficult. Those cameos, you probably had lots of people carving cameos for Augustus. Probably Dioscorides' 3 sons are trained by him and working in a workshop. And when an unsigned work comes out of that workshop, who knows? They're probably signing the works, I'm guessing, posthumously, linking themselves to him. That's their pedigree. But to say that this gem, unsigned, was carved by Dioscorides or Hylos, because I'd have to, I think I can quickly, can I quickly go back? Yeah, I think, I'm going to make you go blind, sorry. I want to take you to the works of the 3 sons. There they are. This gem by Hylos is the size of my thumbnail. It's extraordinarily fine. If it weren't signed by Hylos, I'm sure people would attribute it to Dioscorides because it's so good and he's the famous name, right? This one, 3/4 face, is very, very deep, like my Demosthenes, but bigger and deeper. Again, if it weren't signed, would we know whom to attribute it to? So we have the idea of a family, maybe a larger workshop, within that a craftsman, and we can separate it from work of the same composition that's of much lower quality. But when we get to the work of the master, it's hard. And when we get to the work of very skilled forgers, it's hard unless they make mistakes. And that's what we love when forgers make mistakes, when they use the wrong letter form or they invent a Greek grammatical form that doesn't exist because they're not philologists, right? But I agree with you, it's hard. And in some cases, I've maybe been over-assertive. In other cases, I've maybe been over-skeptical. I've been trying to do this from scratch, although I can't do it without knowledge of previous scholars. And it's reassuring that the core group, we are over the centuries pretty much agreeing with, although my core group is bigger and bigger because I have more material, and I am kind of reinventing the wheel, part of which is a personal indulgence for me, because this is just great fun to work on, to look at and play with this exquisite stuff. Here's my lock screen. I walk around with Demosthenes every day. But this stuff also, it's incredibly rewarding to look at, but it's time consuming. These small things take concentration. You have to look at them carefully. You learn a lot by looking at high quality photographs at large scale. But as I said, the light changes how these things look. At the depth of carving, they're made not to be seen 50 times scale. They're meant to be on a ring on your finger, on a pendant, held in your hand, looked at, rotated in the light. I fortunately have had the privilege to do that with several of these pieces. So that gives me a sense of what the carver is doing. But again, there's a lot more to do.
So don't you need some competition then? I mean, are you the only one who's doing this right now?
No. I was in June in Pisa at a conference on book 37 of Pliny about gems. I gave a shorter but more dense version of this talk to a bunch of gem experts. And we debated the details. But I guess I'm the one in the last 20 years who's trying to go and look at all these things systematically, and not only through photography, which is much improved, but also autopsy. And I think we're a rather friendly collegial bunch. We gem people, so it's not competition.
Well, how many?
But it is a control. We need a control.
You do, because
because it can become subjective, and there is this sense of wishful thinking that one has to really push back on it.
Yes, and a certain quality of obsession, right? So
Yeah, I have it on my phone, I carry it in my pocket, I've grown a beard.
Yeah, we've been friends for a long time. I get to tease him, so it's okay, but.
Okay, just one more thing. You mentioned the trade routes and how the gems came
Yeah.
from different areas. Did the technique of carving your likeness in these tiny little things also get translated? Did that happen in the Middle East and whatever? Who got the idea to carve these?
I'm looking for the map, the gem
Yeah,
map.
right there.
Yeah, it seems the idea arose at various times, both through transmission but through reinvention. There was in the Aegean Bronze Age, we're talking about the Minoans on Crete and the Mycenaeans on the mainland. They picked up gem carving from their contacts in Egypt and the ancient Near East. And they did absolutely stunning carving, using essentially the same techniques and tools. Today, carvers use the same techniques and tools, but they're using electrically powered Dremels or lathes and diamond dust rather than hand-powered ones and emery dust. But the truth is, you don't want high speed. If it's too high, then your abrasive in oil is going to go flying off and you're going to lose control anyway. So you don't need high speed. And emery at 9 on the Mohs scale can cut a cornelian at 7 on the Mohs scale almost as well as diamond is 10. Diamond's going to be more efficient. But if your techniques are basically the same. But what's interesting is these cultures, they're using the same technique to carve work in their own styles. We can very readily recognize a Mycenaean or a Minoan gem and distinguish it from an Egyptian gem and distinguish that from a Greek one. And the Minoan material is especially high quality. A few years ago, American excavators working on Pylos on the western edge of the Peloponnesus excavated an unplundered tomb of a guy they named the Griffin Warrior. There were a lot of images of griffins in the tomb, and there were a lot of gems, including one of the most extraordinary things, showing an agate about that big, 1.5 inches wide, that has 3 figures in battle. And the carving is extraordinary. You can Google the Pylos combat agate. It's coming to the Getty next year or the year after. Do you remember, Nancy? It's coming to the Getty soon. We're doing a show of the finds from Pylos, and we're bringing you the combat agate. And the quality is unsurpassed, but you'd never mistake it for any of the works of Dioscorides I've shown you because it's in Minoan style, but it's carved with the same basic techniques, and it's the same materials and same stones. The shape is also different. There's a different repertoire of shapes. So that's one of the things that's helpful. I didn't show you, well, I did talk about all those Poniatowski forgeries. They're the wrong shape. They're these big, flat ovals. They're not smaller vertical ovals or circles, which tend to be what's prevalent here. And then in the Bronze Age, they're carving lentoids or other shapes. So those are things. And when forgers use the wrong stone or the wrong shape. Also, in the Hellenistic and Roman period, when after Alexander conquers and trade routes open up, you get things like emeralds and garnets, which you don't get in the classical Greek period. So by Dioscorides' time, all these stones are in play, but earlier they're not. So if we get a work that purports to be from classical Greece, but is on a garnet, it's highly suspect because the trade routes weren't prevalent. But still, it's not impossible that one stone makes its way there, but it's a red flag.
I just sort of was wondering about, some sort of really unusual ones you've seen. Maybe not the most finely skilled, but made out of some sort of, I don't know, a ruby from India that sort of made its way all the way over there, or unusual motifs that just really stood out that you went, wow, that's pretty neat. Even
Yeah, there's a sapphire that was excavated in Pompeii that came and that's pretty extraordinary. It seems that in India in the East, and I said sapphire and ruby are pretty much mineralogically the same. There seemed to be great esteem for the red stones and not so much for the gray or white or blue stones. So it makes sense that they're exporting the sapphires, but they're keeping the rubies. That's one reason why the ruby Augustus is suspect. But that rarity of the ruby is one reason why its owner, you know, prizes it so much and wants it to be by Dioscorides, right? But I think there are too many strikes against it there. But one of the things that's unfortunate for the archaeologist is that so many of these stones either never went underground, they were always prized, or they were found in the Middle Ages and they entered royal, aristocratic, or church treasuries. If you go through, you know, European cathedrals and, you know, pay the extra €5 and go into treasuries, you'll usually find boxes, caskets, or crosses that are studded with gems. And if you start looking closely, a number of those gems are ancient intaglios that are mounted. Sometimes they're mounted upside down or even backwards as if to kill the imagery, because the stone is what matters. But it's only where we have the archaeological excavation that we can, well, be absolutely certain of authenticity, although I'm pretty confident of the ones I've shown you, but where we can really tell a story. So knowing that a gem from here was in circulation in somebody's hands in Pompeii by AD 79 tells us a lot about the trade. Then we have the literary sources that tell us about the mining of amethysts and emeralds in the Egyptian desert under the Hellenistic kings, which of course picked up traditions of the pharaohs, the terrible conditions of workers on mines. There's lots of information, literary and archaeological, about the gem trade.
Very cool. And just one other question. What, if someone said, all right, anyone in the world, it's yours, what would you pick? Or maybe you can pick more than one, like go up to like 3. What are your like top favorites out of all the carved gems you've seen?
Well, it would be very unoriginal, but I have to say the Tazza Farnese, which is a cameo cut bowl, double-sided, about that big, that also belonged to Lorenzo de' Medici and many others. Lots of debate about whether it was carved in Alexandria or somewhere else. I don't have a slide of it, but it's, you know, it's your biggest, it was the most valuable thing by far that Lorenzo de' Medici owned. It was number 1 in his inventories. So that's kind of an easy one. It's like if somebody says, what painting would you take? You'd take, you know, the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel or something. It's that kind of thing. I've just really been enjoying looking at these things closely, handling them, and you know, when I was on my way from Naples to Pisa for the conference, I did something that kind of tickled me in its perversity. I stopped in Florence for 2 hours. I had made an appointment. I went to the Archaeological Museum. They gave me the EO, which I had doubts about. I spent an hour with it, very closely looking, was convinced it was by my man, and got on the train and left Florence. You know? There's a lot of other things you could do in Florence, but you know, that was my errand. I got a gelato.
Well, I think we have enjoyed way too much of your time, and it's been really lovely to have you share your obsession with us. And happy hunting. Maybe in another 6 months you can come back and you'll have added to the corpus. Another year, maybe. We'll see.
I hope to see more of these things and to refine the methodologies, because the questions you raised are good ones, and it's often there isn't a smoking gun, a telltale sign for authenticity. Forgery, when something goes wrong, you can say, okay, that's it. But you know, there is the specter of belief that and desire to believe that drives us all. But it's, you know, going through the corpus, what works, what doesn't, and that's the project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ken, and thank you all for your attention. Bye-bye.